the upcoming No Quarter event at Fort Ticonderoga, May 18th, 19th, and 20th. Don't you forget about it. Now, we're portraying Benedict Arnold, who's of course a really, infamous, famous character, great hero, traitor, all that. But we're portraying him in his early days here at Fort Ticonderoga, and we've got pretty good information that he was wearing the uniform of his own personally financed second company of Connecticut Foot Guards. And by their uniform regulations, they were supposed to have a scarlet coat with buff facings and silver buttons. And the neat thing, kind of great coincidence, is here at Fort Ticonderoga, we've got in our collection a Boston Corps of Cadets coat, and which by their, I believe, 1772, their uniform regulations were in, guess what, a scarlet coat with buff facings and buff linings. So it's a neat opportunity to take, a garment that's in our collection that, coincidentally, or maybe not coincidentally, is a very similar uniform to what one of the great characters that was here at Fort Ticonderoga was probably wearing. So we're doing we've done a pretty intensive study of this garment, looking at the construction details, the patterning, the dimensions, and we're going to be building over the next week, as best we can, a copy of this. Now the only sort of caveat, the only sort of problem potentially but we always have to balance. We know by the regulations for the Governor's Foot Guards, they talk about having side pockets but no flaps. So we're not quite sure what that meant, but otherwise, everything else about this coat is pretty darn similar. And it's also pretty neat too that the coat itself is, in some ways it's very fashionable. The narrow cuffs, the narrow lapels, very contemporary to British military fashion at the time. But if we look at it closely, the skirts in this coat are very full. Full like you would see in a coat from maybe as early as the 1750s. We've also got these kind of, in some ways, kind of old-fashioned, very squared-off pocket flaps. So at once, it's both a very fashionable military garment, and in other ways, it's sort of traditional and very, very kind of conservative, maybe even New England style. So as a result, it's a neat coat for us to study, and it's going to be a really cool coat that we'll have, hopefully, on Joel Anderson portraying Benedict Arnold at the No Quarter event, which you all are going to go to, right? One of the kind of cool details about this coat that we're copying in our copy of this coat is the center back pleats. Now, center back pleats are sort of a weird, I won't say vestigial, but they reference a much older time. If you go back to the end of the 17th century, when the basic coat style appears, you've got a whole lot of extra fullness, not only in the side seam of the coat, but also at the center back. And so this is sort of the last bit that you'll see. And center back pleats are really neat to go in, because what you have here, you actually have a lot of extra material. You can see that fullness as I pull it out. You have a lot of extra material that they actually, up at the top here, they actually would slash the coat body itself, and then they would take all this extra and literally just slide it over so that the edge of the here lines up with the center back seam up here. And once that was done, they would take that extra fullness that they had created, that wrinkle, and they'd tuck it in here as a pleat. Now, another sort of, the way they'd finish that off to sort of cover off that seam, that very, very closely done seam, they'd actually put a buttonhole here. And then obviously a buttonhole match on the other side. And then just another buttonhole down below that to sort of, not to match it, to give a nice parallel. If you look at many earlier coats or court dress at this time, you'll actually find the buttonholes done all the way down to the tail. But that would be pretty darn old-fashioned and even a little bit too conservative for this New England-styled coat. So we've gone through, we've drafted out, based on measurements of the original garment, we've drafted out a pattern so we can go ahead and build a reproduction of it. Now, one of the challenges with making a reproduction garment is that each garment originally was designed to fit a particular person. And the original Boston Corps of Cadets coat was designed to fit a guy who was really tall, probably 6 foot, if not well over, and very slender, probably not unlike my own build. The individual who's going to be wearing this, Mr. Joel Anderson, well, he's he's a bigger guy, more like a linebacker. So when we take all those measurements, we want to build the proportions of the original garment and some of the original construction details into the pattern that we drafted. And what you can see is the result of that as we move into going ahead and cutting out all the pieces. Here you see one of the kind of neat details from the original garment. This is the pleat, and it's a pretty deep pleat. I mean, not only is the actual finished line itself a pretty steep angle relative to the body, but then there's all this extra material here that we pleated up. Now on the original, well, this top edge was folded under, and then these would sort of accordion fold up inside. In order to make that happen, though, it takes a lot of material, and one of the things we know from the original garment, based on study of it, is that it was pieced. And so, in order to, again, recreate that's the construction of the original, we're actually going to piece this as well. So we're going to cut it out just like this, and then we're going to actually find another piece of fabric to build that in. And as you can see, by having that pieced, well, it gives us all this room to cut out other parts as well. So after 2 days of work, we've gone from studying the original garment, done the actual pattern that we drafted, cut it all out, which you saw in the previous scene, and now we're into actually recreating this garment. So we've got, this is one of the lapels, which is all stitched together pretty finely. We've got the lining for the front part cut out. Myself, yesterday, got pretty darn far on the back part of the garment. You can see we've got those center back pleats all set in. Right now, all the pleats have been pressed and they've been basted in place so that we can work with this without damaging the pressing we've done. We've even gotten those buttonholes that cover over that seam for the center back pleats done. We actually had to go back to the garment to check it out again, but we went ahead and got some of the real details for securing those pleats in place. Remember those that top stitching that holds that center back pleat down, and the felling stitch, or excuse me, whip stitch, that's holding down the edge of that lining. So this is basically done. The next step on it will just be to assemble it, stitching in the side seams to the front panels, and then whip stitching the lining back over it. Moving along, over here we got the sleeves. The sleeves, we actually were able to copy a really cool detail on the original. If you get real close, you can see that the sleeve itself, the cuff was actually buttonhole stitched around the edge right to the end of the sleeve. Then, once they're stitched together, they're actually pulled apart so that they're actually butted up against each other. There's no seam allowance, there's nothing turned inside. And then subsequent to that, the lining, you can see on this one it's actually been turned, then just gets whip stitched just to the cuff itself. So it's a really neat way of doing it. It's a cool detail we've got here. Moving along here too, we've actually gotten pretty far along on the front panels of the coat. So we've got here's one of the pocket bags that's been started. It's kind of a neat way of doing it, where it's kind of like a welted pocket in this edge has been doubled up, but it's also kind of like a more traditional 18th century pocket. So we flip this on over, you can see on the inside where we've got all the interfacing. It's going to back up the lapels and the front edge. It's going to support the tails and then those pleats. And here the interfacing that's going to support the pocket. And then here's sort of the finished pocket, where we've got the buttons set in with those 2 working buttonholes on the outside, 2 non-functional buttonholes on the inside, and then that finished off pocket back. So I'd say all in all, in about a week's time, we should have this whole garment done.